What if everything you believed about the most famous person on the planet was built on a foundation of comfortable lies rather than uncomfortable biology? What if the greatest mystery was never a secret, but a truth we simply refused to see because the real story required too much empathy and not enough entertainment? The world spent decades staring at a silhouette, convinced it was hiding a carefully crafted illusion, when the actual answer was quietly written inside his very cells, waiting for science to give it a voice. If you are ready to uncover the hidden stories that science finally pulled from the shadows, and if you so, you never miss another deep dive into the untold layers of history and health, and share this with someone who still wonders what really happened behind the spotlight. Your engagement here is not just support for this channel. It is a statement that you value evidence over gossip and understanding over judgment. Let us begin with what the world thought it knew. For decades, the image was fixed in the public. He glided across a stage that shuddered under the weight of screaming crowds. The albums that shattered every record ever set, transforming the music industry into something entirely new. We grew up watching him. We grew up listening to him. We grew up forming opinions about him before we ever learned to form opinions decision. He would belong to them. He would be consumed, examined, analyzed, and explained by a public that treated his life like an open book, written exclusively for their entertainment. Every performance was dissected. Every photograph was scrutinized. Every change in his appearance became a headline, and when those changes became too dramatic to ignore, the public did not turn to medical journals. They turned to their imaginations. They invented explanations that were simpler, darker, and far more entertaining than anything a laboratory could produce. But behind the bright lights and the roaring crowds, there was a quieter story unfolding, a story that never made it to the concert tours, a story that never played on the radio, a story that had nothing to do with show business and everything to do with biology. It was happening at a microscopic level, inside his blood, inside his skin, inside the genetic code that had been passed down through generations of ancestors who never the outside and invented their own explanations. They called it vanity. They called it obsession. They called it a deliberate choice to reject who he was. But biology does not work on choice. Biology works on chemistry. It works on inheritance. It works on the silent instructions that tell our bodies how to build. The first truth we have to understand if we want to see this story clearly is how the human body actually functions at its most fundamental level. Every single cell in your body carries a complete set of instructions. These instructions determine everything from the color of your eyes to the shape of your bones to the way your immune system responds when a threat appears. They are written in a language of 4 chemical letters, arranged in sequences that act like a biological blueprint. This blueprint is not a suggestion. It is not a rough draft. It is a command center. It tells your melanocytes, the cells responsible for producing the pigment that gives your skin its color, exactly how much melanin to make and where to deliver it. It tells your immune system which cells are friends and which cells are enemies. It tells your body how to heal, how to grow, and how to protect itself from a world filled with invisible dangers. When this system works correctly, we never think about it. We move through our days assuming our bodies will simply cooperate. But when something goes wrong with that blueprint, when a single instruction gets misread or misinterpreted, the body does not send out a press release. It does not hold a press conference to explain itself to the public. It simply begins to change, quietly, inevitably, without consulting the person who lives inside it. In the early 1980s, something began to go wrong inside his body. Doctors started noticing unusual changes on his skin. At first, the patches were small. They were easy to miss. They appeared on his hands, on his face, on his neck, places that clothing could not always cover and stage lighting could not always hide. But they did not stay small. They spread. They multiplied. They created a map of white against dark that the world, with its cameras and its magazines and its insatiable appetite for scandal, could not ignore. The public reaction was immediate and brutal. Tabloids ran wild with speculation. Late-night comedians turned his appearance into punchlines that echoed through living rooms across the country. Strangers whispered in grocery stores and hair salons and office break rooms, convinced they understood what was happening better than any doctor ever could. The narrative was already set in stone before anyone bothered to ask a medical question. A famous man was trying to look like someone else. A famous man was rejecting his roots. A famous man was so lost in a mirror that he was chemically erasing himself. The story was simple. It was dramatic. It required no scientific literacy. It required no empathy. It only required judgment. And the world had plenty of that to spare. None of it was true. The truth was far simpler, far more common, and far more painful than any conspiracy theory. The medical term is vitiligo. It is an autoimmune condition. That single word, autoimmune, changes everything about how we should understand this story. It means that the body's defense system, the very army designed to keep illness out and keep you alive, gets confused at a fundamental level. It mistakes healthy cells for dangerous invaders. It identifies melanocytes, the pigment-producing cells that give skin its color, as a threat. It attacks them, it destroys them, it wipes them out with the same ferocity it would use against a virus or a bacterial infection. When those melanocytes die, the skin loses its color in those exact spots. The patches are irregular in shape, unpredictable in their spread, impossible to fully control or reverse. You cannot negotiate with an autoimmune response. You cannot convince your immune system to stand down through willpower alone, or through positive thinking, or through meditation, or through any of the things people who have never lived with chronic illness love to suggest. The disease follows its own biological timeline, and the person living with it simply has to follow along, adapting day by day to a body that is rewriting its own appearance without asking for permission. For a person with naturally darker skin, the contrast created by vitiligo is sharp and immediate and visible from across any room. It does not blend. It does not fade into the background. It announces itself. It becomes a daily reminder that the body is no longer following the original plan. For a man who performed under the brightest lights in the world, on stages in front of millions of screaming fans, this condition was not just a medical inconvenience. It was an existential threat to his career, to his image, to his ability to move through the world without being stared at and dissected. He was diagnosed with this condition in the mid-1980s. His doctors confirmed it with biopsies that removed small samples of skin and examined them under microscopes in controlled laboratory conditions. They documented the results in medical records that still exist today. They explained the progression of the disease to him in private rooms, far from the cameras and the microphones and the shouting reporters. But the world was not listening to doctors. The world was listening to rumors, and rumors travel faster than medical journals ever could. There's another layer to this medical story that rarely gets mentioned, and it matters deeply for understanding the full picture of what his body was enduring. Vitiligo does not usually travel alone. Autoimmune conditions tend to cluster. They run together, like unwelcome guests who arrive at a party in pairs. In his case, the vitiligo was accompanied by a second autoimmune disorder called discoid lupus erythematosus. This is not the systemic lupus that affects internal organs, but a form that specifically attacks the skin. It causes inflammation. It leaves scars. It creates lesions. It makes the skin incredibly sensitive to sunlight, which is a cruel irony for a man whose entire career depended on standing under hot stage lights for hours at a time. The combination of these two conditions meant his skin was being attacked from multiple angles simultaneously. The vitiligo was destroying pigment cells. The lupus was creating inflammation and scarring. Together, they were changing his appearance in ways that makeup could only partially conceal and that clothing could never fully hide. Imagine dealing with one invisible illness that slowly and publicly transforms your appearance. Now imagine dealing with two at the same time, each one making the other worse, each one complicating the treatment of the other. The physical toll alone is exhausting. The emotional toll is heavier than most people will ever carry in a lifetime. Every public appearance becomes performance within a performance. Every photograph becomes potential evidence in the court of public opinion. Every tabloid cover becomes a verdict handed down without a trial. He tried makeup to even out the contrast between pigmented and depigmented areas. He tried clothing to cover the patches that spread across his body. He tried to live a normal human life while carrying an abnormal medical burden. But the spotlight does not allow for privacy. It demands visibility. It demands answers. And when the honest answers are medical and complex, the public often finds them boring. When the answers are dramatic and scandalous, the public finds them irresistible. So the dramatic story won. It always wins. It sells magazines. It drives ratings. It keeps cameras rolling and advertising dollars flowing. The medical story just sits quietly in a file cabinet somewhere, waiting for someone patient enough to read it and brave enough to believe it. The emotional weight of living with visible autoimmune disease cannot be overstated. Every morning, you look in the mirror and see a body that has made a decision without you. Every day, you step into a world that stares first and asks questions later, if it ever asks at all. Every conversation about your appearance becomes an opportunity for strangers to offer unsolicited opinions, uneducated theories, and casual cruelty disguised as curiosity. For someone whose image was already under a microscope, this experience was magnified 1,000,000 times. The entire planet felt entitled to an explanation, but they did not want the real explanation. They wanted the explanation that confirmed what they already believed. Confirmation bias is a powerful force. It shapes how we interpret evidence. It determines which experts we trust. It decides which facts we accept and which we dismiss as fabrications. And when the subject is a famous person, confirmation bias becomes a global phenomenon, reinforced by every headline that tells us what we already think we know. There is a specific treatment that became a central part of this medical story, and it is crucial to understand it clearly because it has been so thoroughly misrepresented. When vitiligo spreads across a large percentage of the body, the patchy contrast between pigmented and depigmented skin becomes medically significant in its own right. It creates uneven sun sensitivity, leaving some areas vulnerable to burning, while others remain naturally protected. It increases the risk of certain skin complications, and in a public figure whose appearance was being weaponized against him daily, it created a psychological burden that no human should have to carry. The medical response to widespread vitiligo is a prescription treatment called monobenzone, sometimes known by the brand name Benoquin. This medication is approved specifically for the purpose of depigmenting the remaining pigmented skin in patients with severe, widespread vitiligo. The goal is not cosmetic in the way tabloids portrayed it. The goal is medical uniformity. It reduces the stark, jarring contrast that makes the condition so visible. It creates a more even skin tone by treating the remaining dark patches. It is a decision made in consultation with a physician for a patient with a genuine, documented autoimmune disease. It is not a choice to become someone else. It is a choice to manage a condition that was already changing the body, regardless of what anyone wanted. He was not trying to erase his identity. He was trying to live with a disease that was already erasing his pigment. The distinction matters. It matters enormously. And the world, for decades, refused to acknowledge it because the alternative narrative was simply more satisfying. The deeper we look into what his DNA was actually doing, the more we realize that genetics is never just about one person. It is about the chain of inheritance that stretches back through centuries, connecting us to ancestors we never met and histories we never learned in school. This is where the story takes an entirely different and equally profound turn. Because while the public was fixated on the surface of his skin, genetic genealogy researchers were quietly uncovering something much deeper. The origin story of who his family actually was, traced back through generations, through the brutal machinery of American slavery, through survival against impossible odds, and through a family story that had been repeated for so long it had become accepted as fact. The Jackson family had always believed and had often shared publicly a piece of their ancestral history. They believed that one of their earliest known ancestors, a man called July Jack Gale, was born to a Native American father. This was the oral history that had been passed down from parents to children for generations. It was a story that carried layers of meaning. It carried identity. It carried pride. It carried an explanation for certain physical features that appeared in the family line. Joe Jackson, the patriarch of the family, was known for his green eyes and the reddish undertones in his complexion. These features seemed to lend some visual credibility to the Native American ancestry story. The family held on to this piece of their history with the quiet confidence of people who had heard it, repeated so many times. It had simply become indistinguishable from truth. But DNA does not care about oral history. DNA does not honor the stories families tell themselves to make sense of a painful and complicated past. DNA is not sentimental. It is not diplomatic. It is a scientific document written in a chemical code that does not change to accommodate feelings or traditions. When a genetic genealogist and researcher began working with a distant paternal cousin of his, a man sharing a common male ancestor through the unbroken father-to-son line, what they found in the Y chromosome data told a completely different story than the one the family had cherished for generations. The Y chromosome is unique in human genetics. It passes directly from father to son, generation after generation, with very few changes over hundreds of years. It is a genetic time capsule. It preserves a record of paternal ancestry that can be traced across centuries and continents. When this cousin submitted his DNA for Y chromosome testing through a reputable genealogy database, the results pointed toward a haplogroup that had absolutely nothing to do with Native American origins. His Y chromosome fell into a specific classification, a sub-branch of a broader group that is overwhelmingly associated with Western Europe. More specifically, the markers pointed clearly and unambiguously toward French ancestry. This was not a marginal result floating in statistical ambiguity. This was not a reading that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on which researcher you asked. The science was clear. The genetic trail led to France. Researchers dug further into the databases. They searched for matches, and they found one. A male descendant of a French family named Richbourg was showing up in the system, sharing the exact same terminal genetic marker as the Jackson cousin. The match was precise and undeniable. When genealogists began tracing the paper trail to match the DNA trail, cross-referencing historical documents with genetic data, the story that emerged was one of the oldest and most painful stories in American history. July Jack Gale, the ancestor the Jackson family had believed carried Native American roots, was not the son of a Native American man at all. He was the biological son of his enslaver, a French man named James Joel Richbourg. The DNA confirmed it beyond any reasonable doubt. The historical records, when painstakingly traced back to Sumter, South Carolina, confirmed it. James Joel Richborg died in 1804. In his will, he left July, the unacknowledged biological son, to his daughter Mary, who had married a man named Josiah Gale. That is where the surname came from. That is how July went from being the unacknowledged son of an enslaver to being an enslaved person with a new name on a new plantation. He carried none of the legal recognition of his biological parentage. He carried none of the inheritance or status that would have come with acknowledgement. He carried only the generational trauma of that erasure. His entire identity, his name, his supposed ancestry, even the story his descendants would tell about him for more than a century, was shaped by the violence and silence of American slavery. The family story about Native American ancestry was not a deliberate fabrication. It was almost certainly a survival mechanism. It was a way to give a fatherless ancestor a different, more dignified origin. It was a quiet substitution of one ancestry for another, a story that developed in the way so many family stories develop when the truth is too painful to be spoken directly in the light. This pattern repeats across thousands of African American families. The shame of sexual violence during slavery, the desire to protect future generations from the ugliness of that truth, the gradual rewriting of oral history to replace horror with something more bearable. These are things that happened in countless households across generations. And they are things that Y chromosome testing is now gently, quietly, and sometimes brutally correcting. He never knew this truth about his ancestry. There's no record that anyone in the family at the time had access to the kind of genetic testing that would have revealed it. The research only emerged years after his passing, pieced together by a cousin he likely never met, in partnership with genealogists whose entire professional purpose is to use DNA to recover the truths that history buried under layers of silence and shame. But the truth matters enormously. It matters because it is part of the complete picture of who he was at a biological level. The level that the world so often talked about but so rarely actually investigated with any scientific rigor or genuine curiosity. Now let us pause for a moment and consider the emotional architecture of this discovery. Imagine living your entire life believing a certain story about where you come from. You tell it to your children. They tell it to theirs. It becomes part of the family identity. It shapes how you understand your own face in the mirror, your own features, your own place in the long river of human history. And then one day, science arrives with a different story. A story that does not celebrate your ancestry but complicates it. A story that does not offer pride but demands processing. A story that reveals pain where there was once mystery. This is the experience of genetic genealogy for many families. It is not always comfortable, but it is always true. And in that truth, there is eventually a strange and hard-earned peace. The truth may not be what we wanted, but it is what happened. And knowing what happened gives us back something that rumors and myths can never provide. It gives us the ground beneath our feet. This brings us to another dimension of the DNA story surrounding him. And this one is murkier, far less scientifically verified and much more sensationalized, though it was largely forgotten by the public after a brief moment of attention. It illustrates perfectly how fame attracts genetic claims that would never survive scrutiny in any other context. In 2014, a Beverly Hills dental surgeon came forward with an extraordinary announcement. He claimed to have obtained a DNA sample from a dental device that had once belonged to the entertainer, a device purchased at auction. The claim itself should raise immediate questions for anyone who understands even basic scientific procedure. A dental device purchased at auction is not a controlled sample. It has been handled by unknown individuals. It has been exposed to unknown environments. It has no verified chain of custody. There is no documentation of how it was stored, who touched it, what contaminants it might have encountered. Real genetic testing requires strict protocols. It requires independent verification by multiple laboratories. It requires peer review by scientists who have no financial or personal stake in the outcome. None of that was present in this situation. The dentist announced that a singer named Brandon Howard was a 99.9% DNA match, suggesting that Howard was the previously unknown biological son. The problems with this claim were numerous and immediate. The chain of custody was non-existent. The methodology was never published in any peer-reviewed journal. There was no independent verification from any credentialed institution. Howard himself, after initially participating in the publicity surrounding the test, released a statement distancing himself from the entire situation shortly afterward. The estate denied the claims clearly and firmly. No subsequent credible scientific body ever validated the results. The story lasted approximately 2 news cycles and then disappeared entirely, which is typically what happens when sensational genetic claims are made without the institutional credibility or the repeatable methodology to support them. But the episode illustrates something profoundly important about the way DNA and fame intersect in the public imagination. His biology was always being claimed by someone, by fans who believed they saw his features in strangers, by people who insisted his children could not possibly be his, by tabloids that spent years treating his changing appearance as a choice rather than a disease. The claims were almost never scientific in origin. They were almost always driven by the desire to have a more interesting, more scandalous, more profitable story than the true one. The truth, as it so often is, was quieter. It was more complex. And it required a level of medical and genetic literacy that the public conversation was simply not interested in cultivating. If you are finding real value in seeing how science dismantles decades of misinformation, I want to ask for your help right now. Hit that like button to push this video into the feeds of people who still believe the old narratives. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are so many more stories where evidence and history collide in ways that will change how you see the world. And share this with someone in your life who needs to understand that the truth is usually more complicated, more human, and more important than any rumor ever could be. Your small action here keeps this kind of deep, honest storytelling alive in an ocean of shallow content. What makes this entire story so remarkable, when you step back and look at the full picture that science has actually painted, is how consistently the documented truth has been more complicated and more deeply human than any of the rumors ever were. The story of his changing skin is not a story about a man who was ashamed of his heritage or desperate to become someone else. It is a story about an immune system that turned against its own melanocytes, confirmed by his doctors while he was alive, confirmed by his autopsy after he passed, and documented in the scientific literature on autoimmune disease in a way that will outlast every tabloid headline ever printed about him. The story of his ancestry is not a story about what any family believed or hoped to be true. It is a story about chromosomes tracing a French lineage through the brutal machinery of American slavery, through generations of silence about how that lineage actually began, and into the present day where genetic genealogy has quietly, permanently, and respectfully corrected the record. The science does not make him into a saint. Science never does that for anyone. The science does not resolve every controversy about his life. It does not exonerate him from every accusation ever made against him. Science never claims to do that work. What the science does, and what it does beautifully when we allow it, is give us the biological truth. It tells us who he was at the cellular level. It tells us what was happening inside his body while the world was making up stories about what was happening inside his mind. It tells us what his DNA was saying in the language that only researchers with the right tools and the right training could translate. And perhaps the most striking thing about this biological truth is how much of it he tried to tell us himself. He sat down with Oprah Winfrey in 1993 in front of 62 million Americans, and he told them directly. He spoke clearly about the vitiligo. He used the medical term. He explained the condition with the simplicity of a man who had been living with it for years and had learned to describe it in ways the public might finally understand. He did not hide. He did not deflect. He answered the question honestly and completely. The audience heard him. The numbers prove they were watching. And then, after the interview ended, and the commercials rolled, and the next day's news cycle began, they largely chose not to believe him. They chose the more entertaining story. They chose the narrative that made him into a mystery rather than a patient. They chose the version that required no empathy, no research, no willingness to sit with the uncomfortable reality that a human being's body was doing something to him that he did not choose, did not want, and could not stop. His dermatologist confirmed the diagnosis repeatedly over the years. His autopsy, conducted by the Los Angeles County coroner in 2009, documented focal depigmentation of the skin across 5 separate areas of his body. That language is now part of the permanent public record. It is not speculation. It is not opinion. It is documentation from a government office tasked with establishing medical facts. The science confirmed the condition at every stage, in every way that science is capable of confirming anything. And still, for years, the narrative that persisted in the public imagination was the one that cast him as a man so lost, so self-loathing, so desperate to escape his own identity that he was chemically erasing himself. That narrative was not just incorrect in a casual sense, it was wrong in a way that caused real measurable harm. It harmed his reputation while he was alive. It harmed his mental health, which he spoke about publicly, describing the pain of being accused of something he was not doing. It harmed his ability to move through the world as a person rather than a projection of other people's darkest assumptions. The cost of misinformation is not abstract. It is real. It lands on real people. It leaves real scars. And in this case, the scars were added on top of a body already scarred by disease. There's a quiet and powerful irony in how the medical community remembers him now. World Vitiligo Day is observed on June 25th every year. The date was chosen intentionally. June 25th is the date he passed away in 2009. The observance was established in recognition of the awareness his journey created, the visibility he gave to a condition that most people had never heard of, before his 1993 interview, and the complicated legacy of being the most famous person in the world to live with something the world refused to understand. A skin disease that he disclosed openly, honestly, and repeatedly became, after his death, the very thing the scientific community used to honor his memory. Not for the music, though the music was extraordinary. Not for the dancing, though the dancing changed the art form forever. But for the brutal, accidental courage of living publicly with something invisible to everyone but himself and the doctors who treated him. That is a legacy that outlives chart positions and sales records. That is an impact that echoes through dermatology clinics and support groups and medical conferences in ways that most celebrity legacies never will. The picture becomes even more complete when we consider what his DNA could not do. It could not make people want to believe something that was less entertaining than what they already thought they knew. That has always been the real problem. Not the science, not the evidence, not the truth that was sitting there in plain sight, waiting to be read by anyone who bothered to look. The world had a story about him, and the world preferred that story. It was simpler, it was more dramatic. It required no medical knowledge, no genetic literacy, no willingness to sit with the uncomfortable and complexity of a human being whose life was genuinely and documentably stranger and harder than most people could imagine. The narrative needed him to be something specific, something troubled, something self-invented, something that had rejected its own origins and tried to become something else entirely through sheer force of will, and perhaps the darkest kind of vanity. That narrative was easier to sell, it was easier to repeat, it was easier to believe. But his DNA said something completely different. His DNA said, in its quiet, chemical language, that this was a man who carried 2 autoimmune diseases attacking his skin from the inside, while the world attacked his character from the outside. His DNA said that this family came from France, through slavery, through survival, through more than a century of not knowing the truth about where they actually began. The biology was never the mystery. The mystery was always the world's stubborn, almost aggressive refusal to believe the truth when it was presented clearly, professionally, medically, and repeatedly by the people who actually knew what they were talking about. The legacy of this story extends far beyond one person or one family. It is a case study in how we collectively respond to visible illness. It is a mirror held up to our appetite for scandal over substance. It is a test of our willingness to admit when we were wrong. Every time we encounter a story about a public figure and their changing appearance, we have a choice. We can reach for the nearest rumor. We can invent a psychology that fits our assumptions. We can join the chorus of voices that turns illness into entertainment. Or we can pause. We can ask if there might be a medical explanation. We can remember that bodies are complicated and that autoimmune diseases do not announce themselves with press releases. We can choose curiosity over cruelty, understanding over accusation. This is not just about one entertainer. It is about how we treat every person whose body does something unexpected in public view. It is about the neighbor with the skin condition, the coworker with the unexplained physical change, the stranger on the bus who looks different and deserves the basic dignity of not being stared at like a puzzle to be solved. His children have chosen, and continue to choose, not to take DNA tests to satisfy public curiosity. This choice deserves the same respect we would extend to anyone navigating a deeply personal question about identity and parentage. In front of a world that has always believed it has a right to know everything about famous families, Prince, Paris, and Blanket have said they are his. Their mother has spoken about the circumstances of the pregnancies. The family bonds are clear to everyone who actually knows them. Their DNA, whatever it may contain, is theirs. It is not public property. It is not a story owed to anyone outside that family. The desire to know is not the same as the right to know. And the right to know does not exist when it comes to the private genetic information of private individuals, no matter how famous their father was. Respecting their boundaries is not about hiding a secret. It is about recognizing that biology is sacred and personal and belongs to the people who live inside it. As we draw toward the end of this exploration, we are left with a clear set of truths that science has established beyond reasonable doubt. He had vitiligo, a documented autoimmune condition that destroys melanocytes and causes progressive loss of skin pigment. His body confirmed it while he lived. His doctors confirmed it through biopsies. His autopsy confirmed it after his passing. His paternal ancestors were French, traced through the Y chromosome of a distant cousin back to an enslaved man who was the unacknowledged biological son of a French enslaver in 18th century South Carolina. That is the genetic record. That is the documented history. That is what was hiding in his DNA all along. Not a scandal waiting to be uncovered, not a conspiracy waiting to be revealed, not the dark secret the headlines always promised, just the truth, complicated, deeply human, fully documented, and deserving at long last of finally being believed by the world that spent so many years refusing to hear it. There is a lesson in this that applies to all of us. Every person carries a story in their cells. Every family has a history that may not match the oral tradition. Every body is capable of surprising the person who lives inside it. The way we respond to these truths, the way we treat the people whose bodies or histories do not match our expectations, says far more about us than it does about them. We can be the generation that finally learns to listen. We can be the audience that finally chooses evidence over entertainment. We can be the ones who understand that the truth is never boring, that it is simply quiet and that it waits patiently for us to stop talking long enough to hear it. Thank you for staying with me through every layer of this journey from the surface of the skin to the depths of the chromosome. If this exploration into the intersection of genetics, history, and public perception resonated with you, then you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so we can continue to uncover the hidden stories that science is finally telling. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how genetic genealogy is reshaping our understanding of family and identity. And share this video with someone who still believes the old narrative. Sometimes a single conversation is all it takes to replace rumor with reality. Until the next deep dive, keep questioning, keep learning, and never let the loudest story drown out the quiet one that is actually true.